The first time I noticed how quiet my life had become was on the drive out of the city. Miles of open road stretched ahead of me, the radio low, my phone untouched on the passenger seat. At home, silence felt heavy. Here it felt wide. I told myself the trip was just work, a temporary escape from deadlines and unfinished conversations. But deep down, I knew I had been craving distance. From routines, from expectations, from a man I loved but no longer felt close to. Ryan and I had built a good life together. That was the sentence I repeated whenever doubt crept in. Good apartment, shared bills, shared friends, shared history. What we didn't share anymore were late-night talks or the kind of laughter that left us breathless. We functioned smoothly, like a machine that had learned to run without warmth. No fights, no passion, just calm, orderly days that blurred into one another. I missed him even while he slept beside me. The ranch was further out than I expected, tucked behind rolling land and wooden fences worn smooth by time. I stepped out of the car, stretching stiff muscles, breathing in air that smelled like dust and grass and something honest. That's when I saw him. Cole Dawson stood near the stable gate, hat low, sleeves rolled just enough to show forearms marked by work, not intention. He didn't rush toward me. He didn't stare. He simply nodded, like he already knew I'd arrive eventually. Long drive, he said, voice steady, unforced. Yeah, I replied, suddenly aware of how out of place I looked. City shoes, city posture, city habits I hadn't realized I carried so visibly. Cole showed me around with an ease that made the place feel less foreign. He spoke when it mattered, stayed quiet when it didn't. There was no performance in him, no need to impress. That calm confidence settled something in my chest. I hadn't felt that kind of stillness around another person in a long time. Over coffee later, he asked simple questions. Where I was from, how long I'd be staying. He didn't pry, didn't rush me into explaining my life. When I mentioned my husband, he didn't react, didn't shift or smile awkwardly. He just nodded again, accepting the information as fact, not complication. That alone felt like a kindness. The days took on a rhythm. Mornings came early, light spilling over the land. Everything quiet except distant movement. I found myself looking forward to those moments when Cole and I crossed paths, by the fence, near the barn, sharing brief updates that somehow felt heavier than small talk. He remembered things I mentioned casually. A project I was worried about. A place I missed. It wasn't flirtation. It was attention. At night, I called Ryan. The conversations were polite, careful. He asked if work was going well. I said yes. I asked how things were at home. He said fine. We both avoided anything deeper, like we were afraid one honest sentence might unravel everything. After hanging up, I'd sit on the porch, listening to the wind, wondering how two people could care so much and still feel so far apart. One evening, Cole joined me without asking. He leaned against the railing, looking out instead of at me. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It felt earned. After a while, he said, "You don't seem like someone who rests easily." I laughed softly. That obvious? Only if you know what to look for. I wanted to ask how he knew, but the question felt too intimate, too revealing. Instead, I shrugged. He didn't push. Somehow, that made me want to say more. I talked about stress, about feeling like I was always arriving late to my own life. I didn't mention Ryan by name, but his absence hung between us. Cole listened. When I finished, he said, "Sometimes people don't need fixing. They just need room to breathe." The words stayed with me longer than they should have. That night, lying in the guest room, I stared at the ceiling, aware of a shift I couldn't undo. Nothing had happened. No lines crossed. And yet, something inside me had stepped closer to an edge I pretended wasn't there. The next day, our hands brushed while passing tools. It was brief, accidental, unremarkable to anyone watching. To me, it felt loud. I pulled back immediately, heart racing, mind already rehearsing guilt. Cole didn't react. He continued what he was doing, giving me space without comment. That restraint made it harder, not easier. I told myself this was harmless, temporary, that once the trip ended, everything would return to normal. But as the sun dipped low and the land turned gold, I realized how carefully I was measuring time now, how aware I'd become of his presence, how quiet my resistance felt. I had come here believing distance would help me remember who I was. I didn't expect to feel seen in a way that made going back feel heavier than leaving. The closeness didn't arrive all at once. It unfolded slowly, in the spaces between tasks, in pauses that lasted a second longer than necessary. I noticed it in how my attention shifted without permission, where I stood so I could see Cole before he noticed me, how my ears tuned themselves to the sound of his steps on gravel. I told myself awareness wasn't the same as intention, that noticing someone didn't mean wanting them. But the line between those truths grew thinner each day. Work gave us reasons to talk, but we rarely spoke about work for long. Conversations drifted naturally, like they had been waiting for the chance. Cole told me about growing up nearby, about choosing a quieter life when everyone else seemed to be racing somewhere. There was no bitterness in his voice, only certainty. He knew who he was. That steadiness unsettled me. I realized how long it had been since I felt sure of anything beyond obligations. One afternoon, clouds rolled in unexpectedly, dark and heavy. We took shelter in the barn, rain drumming against the roof. The world temporarily reduced to sound and shadow. We stood a few feet apart, close enough to feel the shift in air, when one of us moved. Cole broke the silence first. "You ever feel like you're living the life you planned, but not the one you imagined?" he asked. The question landed harder than I expected. I could have laughed it off. I could have changed the subject. Instead, honesty slipped out before I could stop it. "All the time." He nodded, like my answer confirmed something he already knew. "That doesn't make you ungrateful," he said. "Just human." No one had said that to me before. Not like that. Without judgment. Without advice disguised as concern. The rain softened, but neither of us moved. I was acutely aware of how easy it felt to be open with him, how dangerous that ease could become. That night, Ryan texted instead of calling. He said he was busy, asked if I'd eaten. I stared at the screen longer than necessary, typing and deleting responses until I settled on something simple. Love, at that moment, felt procedural, caring without connecting. I hated myself for thinking it, but the truth sat heavy in my chest. The next morning, Cole handed me a mug of coffee before I even asked. "Figured you'd need it," he said. It was a small thing, thoughtful, familiar, the kind of gesture that usually belonged to someone who knew you well. I thanked him, our fingers brushing again, longer this time. Neither of us pulled away immediately. When we did, it felt deliberate, restrained, like both of us had silently agreed this was as far as we could go. Later, while checking a fence line, Cole slowed his pace, so we walked side by side. The land stretched endlessly around us, open and honest, offering no place to hide. He spoke about loneliness, not as a complaint, but as a fact. About how being surrounded by people didn't always mean being understood. I found myself telling him things I hadn't shared with anyone in years. Fears I buried under responsibility. Doubts I never voiced because they felt selfish. At one point, he stopped walking. I took another step before realizing he wasn't beside me anymore. When I turned back, he was watching me, expression unreadable but intent. "You don't have to carry everything alone," he said quietly. Something shifted then, not dramatically, not visibly, but inside me, a door cracked open. I felt the pull of stepping closer, of letting someone else shoulder even a fraction of what I'd been holding. Instead, I nodded and looked away, pretending the knot in my throat was nothing. That evening, we sat near the fire pit as the sky darkened. The conversation was lighter, laughter easier, but beneath it ran a current neither of us named. At one point, Cole reached out, brushing ash from my sleeve, his touch brief and careful. "Didn't want you walking around with that," he said. The intimacy of the gesture lingered far longer than the contact itself. I lay awake later, replaying the moment over and over. Nothing about it was inappropriate. And yet I knew I had crossed something internal, something private. Emotional lines weren't visible, but they were real. I wondered when exactly I'd stepped over mine. The following day, I tried to pull back, kept conversations short, stayed busy. Cole noticed, but didn't call attention to it. He gave me space without withdrawing entirely, a balance that made resisting harder. When our eyes met across the yard, there was understanding there, not expectation, not pressure, just acknowledgement. By the end of the week, I could no longer pretend this was just circumstance. I felt drawn to him in a way that went beyond admiration or comfort. I hadn't touched him. I hadn't said anything explicit, but my thoughts betrayed me. My anticipation did too. Standing alone at dusk, watching the light fade over the fields, I admitted something I wasn't ready to face. I was no longer just visiting this place. Part of me had arrived somewhere else entirely. I woke before sunrise on my last full day at the ranch, the room washed in pale light, my chest already tight with something close to grief. Nothing had ended, yet everything felt temporary now. I lay still, listening to the quiet, aware that the choice ahead of me wasn't dramatic or loud. It was internal, private, and unavoidable. Outside, the land looked unchanged. Fences stood where they always had. The air was cool, steady. I found Cole near the barn, moving with the same calm confidence I'd come to recognize. He looked up when he saw me, offering a small smile that held no assumption. That restraint, that respect, had always been his way. It was also what made this harder. We worked side by side in near silence. Words felt fragile, like if spoken carelessly, they might expose something we had both protected. Yet the unspoken sat heavily between us. I realized then that this connection had never been about escape or novelty. It had been about recognition, about being seen without having to perform or explain. Eventually, Cole spoke. "You heading out tomorrow, right?" "Yes," I said. The word felt heavier than it should have. He nodded, eyes focused on the task at hand. "City calling you back. And everything that comes with it," I added before I could stop myself. He paused, then looked at me fully. There was no challenge in his gaze, no invitation to abandon anything, just honesty. "You don't seem like someone who runs," he said, "even when it hurts." The comment stayed with me long after we finished working. Later that afternoon, I called Ryan. For the first time in weeks, I didn't keep the conversation light. I asked how he was really doing. There was a pause on the line, longer than usual. When he answered, his voice carried the same distance I felt, but also surprise, like he hadn't expected the question. We talked longer than we had in months, not solving anything, not fixing what was broken, just acknowledging it. When the call ended, I sat quietly, understanding something with painful clarity. Love wasn't just a feeling I chased when it appeared. It was a responsibility I chose, even when it felt uncertain. That evening, I found Cole by the fence line, the sky painted in slow-moving color. I joined him without speaking. For a while, we watched the light fade, two silhouettes against open land. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady, even if my heart wasn't. "I need to say something." I began. He nodded, giving me his full attention. "This, whatever this is, it matters to me, more than I expected. But I can't pretend I don't have a life waiting for me, a marriage that deserves honesty, even if it's imperfect." Cole listened without interruption. When I finished, he exhaled slowly. "I figured," he said. "No disappointment, no resentment. I never wanted to be the reason you walked away from something you built." I looked at him then, really looked, and understood the depth of what he'd offered without ever demanding it. "You took the lead," I said quietly. "You showed me something I've been missing in myself." He smiled just slightly. "Sometimes leading just means standing still long enough for someone else to see where they're going." We didn't touch. We didn't promise anything. The moment didn't need that. It was complete as it was, honest, restrained, real. When we finally said goodbye, it was simple. A nod, a shared understanding. The kind that doesn't fade just because distance appears. On the drive back, the road felt different than it had days before. Not lighter, not heavier, just clearer. I knew returning home wouldn't be easy. Conversations would be hard. Choices would need to be made. But I also knew I wasn't leaving empty-handed. I was carrying awareness and responsibility, and the knowledge that connection mattered enough to be treated carefully. The cowboy hadn't changed my life by taking something from me. He'd changed it by reminding me that I still had a choice in how I showed up for it. And that was something I couldn't unlearn, no matter how far the road stretched ahead.